Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm talking to Lynn Strathdee. Lynn, do you want to tell everyone a bit about what you do?
Hi, Claire. I'm a therapist and was a teacher for years and currently spend most of my time at the moment working with clients who are what they would describe as echoistic. So it's having a personality type that sort of inclines you towards narcissistic relationships. So I've kind of made that my specialism. So my background's in psychodynamic therapy, which is a kind of old school modality of training, and I work with clients and make
Mm,
TikTok videos sometimes too.
that's amazing. And did you get into that work because you had personal experiences with narcissists in your life?
Yeah, I did. And I became a therapist because I'd always wanted to, but I had no idea that there was even the possibility of having a personality that would really incline you towards those types of
Mm,
individuals. And way back in long before narcissist was a term that was really used, I had um, one, I think probably my earliest relationship was with someone who was highly narcissistic, my first ever real boyfriend. And because I was married for a very long time to somebody who isn't a narcissist, I'd just kind of forgotten all about that. But when my marriage ended, my relationship patterns became really, really problematic. So when I trained to become a therapist, the two things kind of came together, my personal experience and my training as a therapist, the two things literally kind of came together. And I suddenly found I had an explanation for what probably had been going on a lot longer than since my
yeah,
divorce as I look back on it now. But at the time, I didn't know that. So, yeah, just the timing of it all, really.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So we're gonna have a chat about one of those narcissistic relationships that you had. How did you meet your narcissist?
Well, I had been a recovering addict for many, many years. So I'd been clean and sober
Mm,
for 15 years. And because of some difficulties I've been going through in my work, and I was a teacher and I wasn't happy professionally, and there were some issues at home, but my husband was not an abusive person. So we're just trying to get through it. But at about 40, I relapsed after 15 years of sobriety, which was
mm,
catastrophic really for me, disastrous. And I found myself trying to get back into recovery. And it was when I reached out to, we don't really talk about where we go and what we do, but I reached back out for support and I found myself back in a self-help group, and I bumped into somebody there who, funnily enough, I had known all of those years before when I was a very young woman. I was only 25 when I
mm,
first got into recovery. So I recognized that person, and we had had interactions before, and
mm,
I'd kind of known that he was someone to avoid. But because I had then gone back in at 40, and I was extremely vulnerable because I was still under, the influence, I met him there at the self-help group and recognized him kind of immediately, really.
mm. Yeah. So you were very vulnerable.
I was probably, I think, at the most vulnerable I've ever been. I
Yeah.
had had a very long-term relationship, pretty productive, pretty happy. We'd had a child and I'd built up a career, although I had some career difficulties for sure. But I was overweight, I was using, I'd relapsed, I was full of shame because of what I'd done. And it was very much what I had done, sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? If you relapse, you're really giving yourself a hard time to go back to a bunch of people that have already helped you to say, it's gone wrong. So yeah, I think I was probably at the most vulnerable I've literally ever been. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that because I know a little bit about echoism and I've watched a lot of your videos, there's a big struggle with self-compassion, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, I think narcissism and echoism are both shame based. I think they're just two sides
Mm,
of the same, they're different responses to the same problem, if you ask me. And I think I
yeah.
was very, very, very tough on myself. And I think most addicts are, if there's any relapse at all, you're very ashamed of the fact that you've kind of failed and you've got to go back and ask for help. So and I ironically I think abusive people can spot newcomers, returners, people who are
Mm,
feeling like that. They kind of
mm,
see you because you walk in and you're struggling, And so it's
Yeah.
obvious that you're struggling. But yeah, no, self-esteem absolutely on the floor. And it had been for a while, which is why I relapsed. If I'm honest, I relapsed because I was really struggling. That's
Yeah.
the whole point. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did that relationship start?
No, I saw him in the room and I thought, oh my God, there's that guy. And because I'd been so much younger the first time, funnily enough, I think I was mentally stronger as a younger woman than I was at 40. Because when I saw him at 40, he came up to me and he said, oh God, it's you. And, kind of acting like a bold old friend, kind of like,
Hmm.
and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. He said, oh, we must swap numbers. And I literally kind of scuttled out, said I was going to go for a smoke, and I wasn't. I just got straight in my car and rang a girlfriend and said, "Oh my God, there's that guy," and that was that. I just thought, I hope I never see him again. But I went to another group, and he asked for my number in front of a bunch of people, and I didn't. I was too. This
Yeah.
is another thing. Too polite to say no. He said, "Well, if you give
Yeah.
it to me now, my phone will ring." So I
Mm.
thought, well, I can't even give him a wrong number because his phone's going to ring. And once
Yeah.
he had my number, it was pretty much game over, in all honesty. And I do try to take responsibility for that, for the fact that I gave my number. But I literally, it was game over because the texting started. And once the communication started, it, I mean, I probably don't need to describe to you what happens. You know, everything that you need to hear starts to be said,
Yeah.
and some more things, and
Yeah.
all of that sort of shame and loneliness and all those things I've been feeling, he was able just to completely touch them, kind of tap
Mm.
on those, my sort of
Yeah.
soft spots, and make me feel like actually he was probably going to be someone that could help me. Because
Yeah.
he's a very, very intelligent person, very articulate, very, very good at, I don't want to say emotional intelligence because it's not used for that. It's knowing about what you need to hear and how it needs to be said. And
Yeah.
it was literally like I hadn't eaten. This is crazy now to say this out loud. It was literally like I hadn't had a meal for
Mm.
5 years, and somebody gave me something to eat. It literally felt
Yeah.
like that, as insane as that sounds. And then
Yeah.
once that started, I just, but we didn't actually begin a physical relationship until after I left my marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you say about the emotional intelligence, because we talk about how narcissists have no emotional intelligence, but they have this predatory capacity to scan you for
Yeah.
whatever it is that you're missing, the needs that are going unmet. And they show up and they meet those needs to such a high degree in the beginning that it's impossible to say no to, particularly when you're
Absolutely.
so vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting, you talk about how initially you had this like really disgusting kind of feeling about him. I was exactly the same. I remember on the second date with mine, I felt physically sick around him, and everything in my body was screaming, there's something desperately wrong with this person. I have
Yeah.
to get away from this person. But because I
Yeah.
kept talking to him, it was like just getting reeled in, and just, then the love bombing starts and you learn to
So
suppress your gut reaction.
so confusing because there's all those
Mm.
different things going on at the same time. There's this
Yeah.
need, isn't there, to hear what they have to say, well, certainly in my case, but also at the same time, there's this other thing saying, this is completely bonkers. What are you
Yeah.
doing? Like I
Yeah.
said, as a much younger woman, I wouldn't have given him, wouldn't have considered having any kind of real connection with him.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Was there a pretty intense love bombing period?
I kind of
Or
think
was
of
it
it,
just
funny
like
enough.
colonization? I
It
was
was
just gonna say,
it no 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 no. I think what was difficult was because we had a perceived history that was
mm,
kind of tapped into as it's almost a divine providence. It's almost a this was meant to happen.
mm-hmm,
There was a religious. I don't mean spiritual. I mean almost like a religion aspect to it. Like we were supposed to meet again. You
yeah,
were always supposed to come back to me. It was always me. It's always been me. And
yeah,
again, I mean, saying these things out loud, they sound nuts. Who believes it? But I kind of thought maybe he's right. And one of so it wasn't so much about praise and adulation and oh, you're amazing. It wasn't really that. It was more about intensity and purpose. Like this is a connection that has a real purpose. Like
yeah,
And then he would insert things about my marriage like, you would never have relapsed if you'd been happy. You would
Mm,
never, if you'd been with somebody like me, I, I would never have allowed this to happen to you. So
yeah.
it wasn't love bombing as I've experienced it in other relationships, that
Yeah.
very overt praising and just telling you how wonderful. It wasn't really like that. It had more of a kind of predestined vibe
Yeah.
to it, which
Yeah.
is pulling spiritual stuff.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
know, it doesn't sound crazy because I've had so many clients say that to me, right? They've known the narcissist previously and they come back in and it's like, this is meant to be, this is destiny. And I mean, even in my relationship, I felt like the universe brought us together. Like, I genuinely felt like that. Like, so when you say it, I don't think it sounds crazy because it's exactly what I experienced. And I say this a lot on my podcasts that I do feel like the universe brought us together, but for a different
But
reason than
not for
I
the
thought at the
reason,
time.
not the reason that you thought. Exactly. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What were some of the red flags that you really felt at the time, if there were any, or are they only retrospective?
No, there were plenty. I mean, one of them was
Okay.
that I knew that he had been convicted of stalking somebody else.
Okay.
Um, and everyone knew that. It was talked about pretty openly.
Mm.
And when I discussed it with him, I think I wanted to believe him, so I went along with it. But he made it sound that it had all been one massive misunderstanding, that he'd been manipulated into that relationship, that he had been given so many mixed messages, that yes, he had crossed the line, but it was because the line was confusing and he didn't understand. It sounded plausible to me
Yeah.
at the time because I think I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that it had been an error. I mean, and I also wanted to believe that even if he had done those things, that that was a one and done, that was a terrible situation that he'd learn from. And, you know, again, it's like seeing this good person and this bad person in the same person
Yeah.
and not being able to just get rid of all those good things and focus on the
Yeah.
reality of this guy's got a stalking conviction. He's got a
Yeah.
stalking conviction.
Yeah. But the cognitive dissonance is so strong. And when that person's shining their light on you and it seems like it's meant to be, I
A
mean,
hundred, a hundred
yeah.
percent, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did things start to really change?
Well, I left my marriage.
Hmm.
I spoke, I kind of confessed I was having these feelings. I didn't think it was going to go in. And in fairness, the marriage probably did need to end. So I left my marriage and I moved into a flat and we started this relationship.
Did you move
And
in
it
together?
was no, I got my
Okay.
own place, a little rented place and in town, and we started this relationship and it was pretty much chaos from the minute go. So
Mm.
lots of drama around children, lots of drama around his work or friendship. There was always drama. His car, um, things were just always dramatic and chaotic and difficult. And
Mm.
I genuinely wasn't used to that. So, but I think because I'd kind of gone all in, I felt like, right, well, I can't start questioning this now because I've just left a 25-year relationship for
Yeah.
this. So
Yeah.
this needs to not look crazy. So there would
Yeah.
be drama around, constantly having burst another tire and needing money, constantly having a child that needed bailing out of some kind of disastrous situation, another argument with somebody that we both knew about something that was said or whatever. There just always seemed to be drama and problems. And from a personal point of view, one of the things I found the most difficult was this encroaching need to constantly be texting you, calling you, turning up. So yeah, I lived on my own, but he was constantly making his presence felt, like all the time, just
Yeah.
constantly feel like a relationship. It suddenly felt like, right, we're suddenly in this thing that's now going to last. We weren't discovering how to be together. It was like
Yeah.
we're settled into
This
this
is
thing
it.
now. This is
Yeah.
it now. Yeah.
Did that constant calling, texting, turning up, was that disguised under I care about you and I'm just checking on you and making sure you're okay? Did it feel like care or did it feel like the control and monitoring that it
It felt
was?
like it felt like the control and monitoring, but it also felt like chaos and drama. So he would ring
Mm.
you as if you were helping him. Like, I'm in this situation. I need you to, you know what I
Yep.
mean? Oh my God, you're never going to believe what's happened.
Yep.
Rant, 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 rant. So when you'd see the phone go, your heart would kind of sink because it was always a problem. You were never just having chats about nice things. It was
Yep.
always to discuss the latest saga of whatever it was. And no, he wasn't a great one for telling me he loved me and missed me and all that jazz. That would always
Mm.
come when there was a breakup between us. That's when he would really lay that stuff on. But
Mm.
if I'm honest, it felt like I owed him some sort of responsibility of care. It felt like I
Yeah,
had a
because they
duty of,
parentify you. Yeah,
yeah,
they turn you into their parent. Yeah, and you have
yeah.
to look
It felt
after
like
them.
my child was ringing me,
Yeah.
like going, "Oh, Mum, I've left my lunch." Like, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe it. I've got nothing to eat.
Yep.
What are we going to
Yep.
do?"
Yeah.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, because they exist through creating chaos and they need the strong emotional reaction and chaos to go on around them in order to exist, don't they?
Yeah, completely, completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there like a big uh-oh moment that happened? Or was it just this continuous thing? Like, what was
Oh,
the first uh-oh moment?
there was so many things. So one, obviously the fact that he'd been convicted of stalking was a big problem, which I tried to just kind of block out. But one of the first things that happened that I thought, this is really worrying, was when he talked about he had this other property and he said something about he wanted to do it up. And I said, well, where would he get the money for that? And he said, well, obviously it's going to come from you or it's going to come from me, but it's going to come from one of us. And I remember thinking, oh my God, suddenly, just for a moment, like the penny dropped because I've just been divorced. I've just got a divorce. I'm working through a financial settlement. And I just thought, hold on a minute. What do you mean I'm going to be paying for it? What? So that was a bit of a concern. There were other things like him constantly being places in town, because it's quite a small town. You go to the market or you go to the, I don't know, to the shops, and he would kind of be there, show up there. And I started to think, this feels like a bit random, like you're suddenly in places where I am. And because I knew about what he'd done before, and even though we're in a relationship, he just always seemed to kind of be appearing in places.
Mm.
One of the things I found really disturbing is he would often, because he was quite a bit older than me, want to walk places together only to be seen by other people. So he'd say, we need to go, I don't know, so and so cafe, or let's walk in front of the cafe. We don't need to stop, but let's just walk in front of it. And I think, well, so we're just going to go there so that other people can see that you have a girlfriend. That's it. We're just going to make sure other people can see it, you know, stuff
Yeah.
like that. Weird stuff that's never,
Yeah.
ever happened before.
They're all the same, aren't they? Because I'm just reflecting on another narcissistic relationship that I had with a guy who we did fight sports together, and he was a Muay Thai trainer. And he would pull me up in front of the whole class, in front of everyone, and hold pads for me. And the whole time, like, he'd be standing there with me in the middle of class, he'd be looking around at everyone to make sure everyone was watching us. Because I think everyone else thought he was a bit of a creepy loser. And he loved like plastering me everywhere, and he'd be up there like just making sure everyone's looking.
Are you
Yeah,
looking? Are you looking? Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, one time, for example, that I thought there's something seriously wrong. He started an argument in the middle of the night, and
Mm.
I had been sleeping, and it was my rented flat that we were in, and he started this argument, and I wound up to get some peace and go back to sleep in my car, asleep or trying to sleep in my car with him in my flat. And I thought, what the
Mm.
hell? What the hell is going on? What the hell is
Yeah.
going on? On another occasion, we had an argument. And again, I don't want to make it sound like, I had the perfect marriage. I didn't, but we never rowed and fought violently or aggressively. We'd have disagreements like everybody, but we didn't have
Mm.
screaming matches where people felt threatened. And on this one occasion in the rented flat, I said, and I wish for the life of me I can remember what it was. I said something that pissed him off, and he became very angry. and I felt like he was going to go for me. And I ran down the corridor into the spare room, and it had one of those tiny little brass bolts that you
Mm.
push across. And I ran into the spare bedroom. I slammed the little wooden door and pushed the bolt across. And he pulled the door so hard he ripped the bolt off the wall. I only know because it was a rented flat. I remember thinking, great, so now the bolt has literally been pulled out of the
Is that
woodwork.
what you thought?
What's
You're in
that?
danger. Is that what you thought? You're in danger for your life, and he rips the door off, and you're like, "Oh, we're in a rented flat. I'm gonna have to pay for this."
It's one of the things I thought. Yeah, how ridiculous. Yeah, but that is one of the things I thought is, oh my God, you damaged the door. It's not my door. I'm going to get in trouble. Yeah, but literally chased me down the corridor.
Yeah.
And I've never ever been chased or threatened physically by a
Mm.
man. I'm pretty sure I can say that that's never happened. And I literally
Mm.
thought, oh my God. And to be fair, when he opened the door, he obviously didn't know what he was going to do because he
Mm.
didn't hit me. But he then, I mean, lots and lots of times I felt very physically unsafe around him, which we'll probably talk about later. But yeah, that was the
Mm.
first time I thought, okay, these things are really starting to be pretty bad now.
Yeah. How far
Yeah.
into the relationship was that?
That was, I mean, it didn't even last probably more than a year in total, even with all its breakups and get backs together. So that would have probably been
Mm.
about not even 6 months in, probably less.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Let's call it at most 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
mean, a year is a long time when you're with someone like this. It's like time kind of slows down and speeds up.
Horrendous. Horrendous.
It's a long time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Was he ever physically violent, or was it the threat?
There was repeat threats of it, and there was police
Mm.
involvement. So the one of the worst times was when we were away together, and in this cottage in the middle of, literally in the middle of nowhere, which he had a connection to. This place, I'd never been there before. And when we got in there, I felt like he was wanting to kind of commandeer my time. And you'll know what I mean by that. He kept asking me to do things to help him, but it almost felt like he was coming up with things so that I couldn't do
Yeah.
things that I enjoy, like read a book or listen to a podcast or just
Yeah.
entertain myself, enjoy the scenery, whatever. It felt like every 2 minutes there was another,
Mm-hmm.
Lynn, can you come? Lynn, can you come? And at one point I thought, I just need, this is really miserable, actually. I'm not having a nice time. The place was in not great shape and we were kind of stuck there and I wasn't enjoying the company and the atmosphere. And I can remember just kind of shutting down and not wanting to
Mm-hmm.
speak. I just thought, I just don't want to talk to you for a while now. I
Yeah.
just need you to give me some space. And once he cottoned on that I wasn't speaking, he wouldn't let up poking to try and get me to speak, to,
Yeah.
be
Get a
engaged.
reaction.
And
Yeah.
exactly. And I think I had an iPad or a kid. I remember being engaged in a story, and it went on, obviously to his mind, way too long, and he absolutely lost his shit with me about, this is effing ridiculous. And he started throwing things around. And I mean by that, brooms, a brick was thrown, my phone was thrown, the language was terrifying. And we were literally in the middle of nowhere. And
Mm.
I got out of there and I ran up this little lane and it was dark. And there was a derelict caravan at the bottom of the lane, and I hid in there and I could hear him shouting, and he ran down after me. He didn't think to look in the caravan, and he turned around and went back to the cottage. And I just waited long enough because there was nowhere for me to go. I mean, we were literally in the middle of the countryside,
Yeah.
and and um, and I just thought, right, well, if I just give him time to calm down, and then I'll go back in. So I did, and I lay down, and I can remember just lying stiff as a board and saying, when are we leaving? And he
Mm.
said, and I'll never forget it, he said, we're not leaving. And my blood went literally cold because I just thought, oh my God, that
Yeah.
it's happened. I'm in the middle of nowhere with someone who's very happy to scare the life out of me, and I may never get out of it.
Yeah.
So never physically hit me, but that incident in the cottage, I'll never forget. I'll never ever forget running off down the lane in fear
Yeah.
and having to hide and wait. Terrifying, utterly
Yeah.
terrifying.
Yeah. And I mean, they do these things when they have that ultimate control over you. When you can't get away, they'll take you away somewhere where you don't know anyone or you're in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And that's
Absolutely.
when the mask really comes off.
Yeah, it was the most scary thing I've ever been, well, almost the most scary thing I've ever been through.
Yeah. What happened?
We did drive back, and it was several hours driving back. And um, I'm trying to think. I think he was driving, and I remember the driving being very erratic
Mm-hmm.
and being very, very scary. The atmosphere in the car. The next morning, I said to him, I just thought I'm just going to get up and start packing, because if I act like I'm leaving and I don't, because I think even he knew he'd crossed a line the night before, because he knew we were at some point, unless he was really going to do something terrible to me, and I don't believe he was, we were going to have to go back to those people that we knew. I was going to have to say something. And I think probably the wheels started turning of, oh, I have to repair this somehow now, because if I don't, she's going to be a loose cannon going back
Yeah.
where we were, where we know people. So the
Yeah.
next morning, I just started packing, and he silently started packing as well. So we got the car packed up and we drove back, but there was silence at one point. I remember him screaming, "You treat me like an effing C, Lynn,"
Mm-hmm.
screaming at the top of his voice. And I was just petrified. And then we got home and I called the police. And I'd love to say that was the end of the relationship, but it wasn't, you know.
What happened when you called the police?
Well, they arrested him. And
Hey.
as as is so often the case, at the time, I just wanted something to happen so he could never do this to anyone again, and that
Mm.
he would stay away from me forever. And they
Yeah.
arrested him. And then they, of course, the police ask you, do you want to make a statement? And I said yes. And then I made my statement. And then once they released him and he got back in touch with me, I withdrew my statement, because
Yeah.
they couldn't hold him. They had,
Yeah.
could have made a prosecution, but they would have needed my statement for a prosecution to hold up.
Yeah.
And guilt that I felt for having him
Yeah.
arrested, believe it,
Yeah.
after a few weeks had passed, the guilt that I felt for the fact that I'd had him arrested was unbelievable. I couldn't bear it.
Mm.
Even though rationally I knew it was absolutely the right thing to do. And then I actually saw him, and you talk about parentification. I saw him in the street, and it was a summer's evening, and he looked childlike, and I felt like a mother betraying their
Yeah.
child. I
Yeah.
literally felt like I'd just sent my child off, um, and done something terrible to them. And so I said to the police, forget it. I didn't want to withdraw my statement. Forget about it.
Yeah. And they're so good at activating that maternal instinct and appearing childlike and innocent when the reality is that they use that as a weapon because they're actually a monster and they're so good at manipulating.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? As a therapist who works with echoists and survivors of narcissistic abuse, what would you say to a client who is experiencing that same guilt at potentially pressing charges against their narcissistic abuser?
I
How
would
would
say
you help them
I,
navigate
I
that?
I would try and draw their attention to the fact that the guilt is a defense that they've been using their whole life to stay in relationships to people that they need to step away from. That guilt is what keeps, that feeling of guilt keeps bonds going where
Mm.
the bond needs to be broken. And I think we need to recognize that people are scared to lose these relationships,
Yeah, I mean, the
even though
trauma
they're
bond is
sick.
so strong. Yeah,
It's so terrifying. But the guilt would have been useful at one time in life. That guilt would have been probably essential at one point, because echoistic people have adapted this way for, it's not, they haven't had healthy relationships historically. So the guilt has been absolutely necessary to keep those bonds going. But that guilt is now kind of enabling them to stay in things that they need to leave. So the guilt in itself is like a distortion. It's a kind
mm,
of it's like a hall of mirrors at the fairground. You're looking in the distorted mirror. That
yeah,
feeling is a distortion, and it's
mm,
an adaptation, a maladaptive distortion of
Hmm.
your emotional state.
Mm. Are you able now to look back at yourself in these situations with compassion?
Well, yes. I mean, as you know, it's not the only time I've gone through something similar. Um,
Mm.
so, yes, with a lot of compassion, but also with I've learned a lot about this kind of stuff, as you have, possibly from a slightly different perspective, because I totally get the way that you help clients, and that's been so important to me to learn about the stuff that people like you have been teaching me. I massively, massively important. But I think that compassion is only useful to me if I also apply knowledge and some basic understanding that some of us can't use the same parameters as other people.
Hmm.
We're just, it's a bit like having a neurodivergence. You have to accept that there are certain stimuli that are,
Mm.
because it's like an addiction. And, as someone in recovery anyway, you have to
Mm.
be realistic about yourself, if you know what I mean. So, yes, I have
Mm.
compassion for myself, but I also have quite a healthy, I think, quite a healthy um, sense of realism around it, which I didn't have. I had a naive lack of realism before, if that makes sense. Do you know what
Yeah,
I
it
mean?
does. Yeah, it does. Yeah. So, how did that relationship end?
Fun enough, after all of those things, as you know, it ended and got back together like a million times. But when it got crazier and crazier, because every time there was a break, the stalking behaviors got worse. So the being under my door, I used to be a smoker and I'd be hanging out the apartment window having a cigarette, and then he'd be standing underneath my window. Or people
Mm.
would ring up and say, I've just seen him outside the flat next door. He's standing under the doorway. Or I was at my workplace and I literally was on the phone discussing with a friend how terrified I felt. And I turned around and he was standing behind me. You know,
Yeah.
the things were getting so crazy that I thought, well, he's clearly stalking me. This is ridiculous.
When you guys would break up and get back together, who usually ended it?
Always me,
Always you.
always me, and it was
Okay.
always the same person. He would
Hmm.
cross some kind of ridiculous line, some insane line that I would think,
Hmm.
what am I doing? And I would step out a bit, and because I didn't maintain no contact, I would always wind up back in it again.
Mm.
It's like I remember knowing that he had a conviction, ringing the estate agent to say, listen, I need to move to a town not far from here because his previous conviction prevents him from going there. So
Okay.
this would, me living there would save me ever having to think about this again because I still didn't want to go down the police kind of route. And the agent said to me, oh, yeah, we've had that person on the phone, seeing if they could get into your flat as pretending to be a prospective
Yeah.
tenant. So
Right.
all of those things. So when you say, how did it end? It was just, there was one of those weird things too many, Claire. Like on this one day, I'd gone away to Dubai. My brother lives in Dubai, and I'd gone to Dubai, and he dropped me at the airport, and I'd said, if you drive me to the airport, you're very welcome to drive me, but take my car back and leave it because we were sort of together vaguely at this point. I said, but please don't drive my car while I'm away. Please don't. And of course, I got back, and my car was in the garage because it had been pranged. I mean, I can't
Mm.
prove that. I just my car was in the garage getting repairs it didn't need before I left, and there we are. But and at that point, I had just had enough. I
Mm.
just had enough by then. So then I did pursue a prosecution with
Okay.
all of the stuff. And when I went in to make my statement that I didn't retract, because I think I'd done it 3 or 4 times, made statements,
Yeah.
explained what had been going on about the stalking and the behavior, and I could read, when you're sitting opposite someone and you can read their paper upside down. And
Hmm.
it said 12.5 thousand messages, either to Lynn Strathdee or about her. So they'd
Wow.
obviously by this done a trawl of his phone, and they must put search terms in to see like how many times. And that was in
Wow.
less than a year, or just a year. No more than a year. But yeah, sort of January to December type thing.
Wow. And he was
Yeah.
prosecuted?
He pleaded guilty. Yes. So it was during COVID
Okay.
and he pleaded guilty
Did he
so
go
that
to
we
jail?
didn't. He did quite a time on remand while he was waiting, for the charges to be, I don't know, for the Crown Prosecution Service to actually get the, process together. He was on remand. So I think he spent a bit of time on remand and then they released him and it was COVID. And I didn't particularly want him to take the slightly lesser conviction because in the UK, there's a more serious stalking.
Mm-hmm.
There's a stalking with threat of violence, and then there's stalking without threat of violence. And originally he was charged with stalking with threat of violence. And the CPS were like, well, we think we've got enough to convict. But he agreed to stalking without threat of violence. And the
Oh,
CPS advised me to accept it. And I wasn't mad keen on the idea, but the CPS won't spend all that money if they don't think they're going to get a prosecution. And we didn't know that we had quite enough to prove what happened in those stories I've just told you. Like, what evidence do I have of those things?
it's so hard.
So hard to
Yeah.
prove it. But the stalking was no problem to prove. And to be fair, he pleaded guilty to it. So,
Wow. And
yeah.
he stopped.
Well, he had to because there's a 10-year restraining order and he's not allowed to be anywhere where I could reasonably be expected to be. Having said
Mm.
that, I've seen him and he doesn't bat an eyelid. He doesn't attempt to move or go anywhere.
Yeah.
It feels like I'm the person who has to go somewhere if he's there.
Yeah. I mean, often that's the case, isn't it?
Yeah,
And it's, I guess, a good thing that he's the kind of person that adheres to the stipulations because some will just continue turning up anyway and can become, yeah.
yeah. I think the thing about the original conviction was, I think for the first 2 years, if there was any reoffending at all, it would have been a custodial. It would have been straight
Okay. Straight.
too. So
Yeah.
I think that gave us some comfort. And I'm older now. I'm less frightened. I'm less
Mm.
frightened. I mean, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't be frivolous, but I'm not the frightened girl,
Yeah.
45-year-old girl that I was.
Yeah. Did you still feel the trauma bond at that point?
No, by then, because I
Okay.
because I'd finally understood how important actual no contact was. By then, we'd had a really long stint of having zero contact,
Okay.
so I had completely detoxed.
Detoxed.
If you
How long was
if you
that
know,
stint?
it takes months and months and months and months, 6 months maybe, six
Mm.
months, and then I would still sometimes have a pining feeling of like,
Yep.
oh. And as an addict, I can really relate to that. That feels
Hmm.
like the urge to smoke a cigarette or, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
yeah,
I mean,
totally.
they've put people that are trauma bonded in brain scans, and it literally does light up the same part of the brain that has to do with addiction. So a trauma
Yeah,
bond, it really is like an addiction.
100%. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who are in recovery, I'm not saying will experience it worse, but I think are probably more easy to find themselves in those
Mm.
situations because they're sort of pre-wired for
Yeah.
that massive.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone can be victimized. We know that, don't we? But
Yeah.
I think addicts are sort of preloaded for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's a pre-existing vulnerability, and these kind of predators are attracted to vulnerability. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that you talked about being in a long-term marriage because I find a lot of narcissists and psychopaths find their way in with people who are unhappily married in
Yeah.
situations where their needs have gone unmet for a long period of time. And that's
100%. And they
often an
will
easy
convince
in.
you that your marriage is worse than it is when maybe you're just
Mhm.
having some marital difficulties like couples do after
Mhm.
20 years. But that person will convince you that, and I was chatting to a girlfriend about this before we joined the call, and she's had a similar experience to me. And she said the thing is they make they create your problems and then they make themselves the only solution to your
Yep.
problems. And because you're so bonkers, your friends are like, and you're being not right. You're not being yourself. And so your friends are kind of like, oh, I don't know what to do with you. You don't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. So then
Yeah.
you're so isolated.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So, how did you get into educating about echoism on social media and kind of creating your platform out of all of
Sure.
this stuff?
Well, I had been watching other content creators, aka you, for a few years, and I
Mm,
always thought, "Girl, that's amazing to do that." But
mm,
but there are good people. I mean, it doesn't need to be done better or different than
mm,
what's already out there. But when I was doing my degree and desperate to learn about how I could make sure I never did this again, I thought I don't want to
mm,
study narcissism because there's so much available on it. I want to see if I can understand what's going on for me. And I found various papers and books that explain quite clearly that you can explain what's happening for certain individuals in a very clear way using psychoanalytic theory. And
mm,
I did a presentation for my degree, and I read all the material that I could find, and then I did a presentation for my degree. And because it has so changed how I understand myself, it really has.
mm,
It made me want to share it because I thought actually if you've got people like Claire or Richard or whoever doing what they're doing, then it can only add to the conversation if people can be
yeah.
aware that they are preloaded. Some of us are preloaded for this kind of stuff, and that actually
Mm,
if we go back beyond the triggering relationship, the chances are that there's been a whole line of them before that, which is
mm,
definitely true in my case.
yeah. Yeah.
So then it just
100%.
made me want to share it. And I'm not the best at it, but I enjoy trying and I'm definitely learning to do it. And there seems to be some interest in it. I think people are interested in echoism. I think
Yeah, absolutely. I think it provides a lot of answers to people who are just kind of trying to figure out what's going on. So, what advice would you give to someone who's in one of these relationships and trying to get out?
I would say that I would try and see it as an addiction. I think your brain
Mm,
is addled. I think it's addled. And I think that the most difficult thing is that the isolation and the cognitive dissonance will have you believing that there is something good in this for you.
yeah.
That's a lie. There is nothing good in it. There is nothing good in it.
Mm,
And unfortunately, when you're standing in the middle of it, you're probably the only person that can't see it. So if you have
mm,
one friend or one family member or just one person who hasn't abandoned you yet due to your, you know, the way that your life's been spiraling out of control, then I would say try and use that one person or small network to try
yeah.
and bring you back into reality because your reality's completely left the building. There's nothing good
Mm,
about it and it's never going to get better. And I don't think you can do it alone. So even if someone was totally isolated because of the relationship and they were in hell and they were in one of these awful relationships, then I would say find a professional because maybe
mm,
you can't get something from a family member that you need,
mm,
but find someone who understands this
yeah.
absolute nightmare, who
Yeah.
can start to work with you to bring reality back in.
Mm. Steve Hassan, who is an expert on cults, talks about when people are trying to get out of cults, those relationships, that one person that you're talking about, that friend, that family member who's outside of the cult or outside of the relationship, as being an escape hatch relationship.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've never heard of him, but yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
he's
You
really
just
good.
need one of the people who can help you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, what are your social media handles and your website? Where can people find you?
Okay, so I'm on TikTok as the Echo Chamber. That's
Mm,
just on TikTok. And then I have a website which is echoistrecovery.com.
mm.
That's it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Lynn. I think it's been a really important conversation.
Thank you for having me, Claire.
It's been good talking.